Section 5 of the Story of London. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Paul Lawley Jones. The Story of London by Henry B. Wheatley. Chapter 2. The Walled Town and Its Streets. Part 3. Sir Robert Hales, the treasurer, was a marked man, and his manor house at Highbury was burnt and utterly destroyed. Jack Straw's castle, which was built on the site of the Highbury castle, retained the name of the second leader of the revolt almost to our own time. Later in the same day, the Priory of the Order of St. John at Jerusalem, at Clerkenwell, of which Hales was prior, was burnt by the men of Essex, who in their march to London had previously attacked the Priory of the Order at Cressing, Essex. Stowe informs us that the Commons passed through the city and did no harm. They took, quote, "nothing from any man, but bought all things at a just price, and if they found any man with theft, they beheaded him." End quote. This, however, was soon changed. First, they were joined by the dangerous classes in the city, who were glad of an opportunity of punishing their enemies the Flemings by the riverside, and the lawyers of the Temple. Then the prisons of Fleet, Newgate, and Westminster were broken open, and hordes of rascality were added to those contributed by the Marshalsea. To add to these elements of disorder, the men became drunk with wine supplied by the rich citizens, and we hear no more of restraints. Gross outrages against property and life now follow one another rapidly. Much damage was done in Fleet Street and the Temple. The rolls and records of the lawyers were burned or otherwise destroyed. The royal account book suffered in the same way. Stowe relates that the insurgents, quote, "determined to burn all court rolls and old muniments, that the memory of antiquities being taken away, their lords should not be able to challenge any right on them from that time forth." End quote. Not content with destroying the documents, they desired to destroy the producers of documents. Again, Stowe tells us that, quote, "they took in hand to behead all men of law, as well apprentices as utter barristers and old justices. With all the jurors of the country whom they might get into their hands, they spared none whom they thought to be learned, especially if they found any to have pen and ink, they pulled off his hood, and all with one voice crying, 'Hale him out, and cut off his head.'" End quote. The only place of safety was the Tower, and here the young king watched the flames in several parts of the city, and listened to the turbulent cries of the mob on all sides of him. Just beneath, on the east side, near St. Catherine's Hospital, was an encampment of the rebels who clamoured for the murder of the Chancellor and others who had taken refuge in the Tower. This was an eventful day for all, crowded with actions more than enough to terrify a boy suddenly called upon to act. The councillors were hurriedly called together, and after considering the serious dangers which surrounded them, agreed to a policy of concession. The rebels, however, were invited to meet the king at Mile End on the following day. On Friday, the 14th of June, the king and his court went to Mile End to hear the demands of Wat Tyler and his followers. We learn from the Stowe manuscripts, referred to above, that when they arrived, the Commons came to the king, and all knelt to him, saying, quote, "Be welcome, our Lord King Richard, if it please you, and we will not have any other king than you." And Wat Tyler, master and leader of them, praying to him, the king, on the part of the Commons, that he would suffer them to take and have all traitors that were against the king and the law. End quote. The demands are recited as follows in the manuscript. Quote, "that no man should be a serf by birth, nor do homage or any manner of suit to any lord. No man should be a serf to any man except by his own will, and by covenant duly indentured. To give 4d. for an acre of land." End quote. Stowe gives the demands in fuller detail. Quote, "The first, that all men should be free from servitude and bondage, so as from thenceforth there should be no bondmen. The second, that he should pardon all men of what estate soever, all manner actions and insurrections committed, and all manner treasons, felonies, transgressions, and extortions by any of them done, and to grant them peace. The third, that all men from thenceforth might be enfranchised to buy and sell in every country, city, borough town, fair, market, and other place within the realm of England. The fourth, that no acre of land holden in bondage or service should be holden but for fourpence, and if it had been holden for less aforetime, it should not hereafter be enhanced." End quote. Stowe adds, quote, "These and many other things they required. Moreover, they told him, the king, that he had been evilly governed till that day, but from that time he must be governed otherwise." End quote. After consultation with his courtiers, the king conceded everything asked by Wat Tyler. They agreed that serfage should be abolished, and that all servile dues should be commuted for a rent of fourpence per acre, and a general pardon was pronounced on all. Clerks were set to work to draw up charters of liberation and pardon in proper legal form for every village and manor, as well as for every shire. While these arrangements were going on, the soldiers, who could have kept the Tower with ease, were ordered, or at least permitted, to let in the mob. This appears to have been part of the agreement, and we cannot but brand it as a wicked compact, as it was clearly the duty of the court to protect its servants. The unfortunate Legge, the farmer of the poll tax, was murdered, and a learned friar, the friend and adviser of John of Gaunt, was torn in pieces as a substitute for his patron. In the chapel, Archbishop Sudbury and Hales were torn from the altar and hurried to Tower Hill, where their heads were struck off and straightway placed on London Bridge. John Ball was said to be among the first who entered the Tower, and to have directed the outrages. The mob suffered the Princess of Wales to escape by boat, when she went to the Queen's wardrobe, which had been given to Queen Philippa, and was afterwards called the Tower Royal in the Vintry Ward. In some accounts, it is said that she went to the wardrobe in Carter Lane, but this is a mistake. The king, after his return from Mile End, joined his mother at the Queen's wardrobe. On Friday and Saturday, as they received their charters, the bulk of the insurgents left London and returned to their homes, leaving the residue and more dangerous masses behind them. Mr. Trevelyan relates how the king and his nobles rode out from the Queen's wardrobe through Ludgate and Temple Bar, passed along the Strand by the smouldering ruins of the Savoy to Westminster. This was on Saturday the 15th of June. The royal party was met at the doors of the Abbey by a sorrowful procession of monks in penitential garb, bearing the cross before them. The king dismounted and kissed the cross. The nobles, the courtiers, and men-at-arms entered the church and performed with unusual fervour the acts of piety. The reason why the monks were in this subdued condition was owing to the fact that a violation of sanctuary had just occurred. The insurgents had marched on Westminster, broken open the exchequer, destroyed the books and records, and violated the sanctuary. Richard or John Inworth, warden of the Marshalsea, after the destruction of that prison, had fled for refuge to Westminster Abbey. On their arrival, the mob found him at the shrine of Edward the Confessor, and having torn him away, carried him back to the city, where his head was struck off on the block in Cheapside. Stowe gives a vivid account of the king's visit to the Abbey. Quote, "The same day, June 15th, after dinner, about 2 of the clock, the king went from the wardrobe called the Royal, in London, toward Westminster, attended only by the number of 200 persons, to visit St. Edward's shrine, and to see if the Commons had done any mischief there. The abbot and convent of that abbey, with the canons and vicars of St. Stephen's Chapel, met him in rich copes with procession, and led him by the charnel house into the abbey, then to the church, and so to the high altar, where he devoutly prayed and offered. After which he spake with the anchoret, to whom he confessed himself. Then he went to the chapel called Our Lady in the Pew, where he made his prayers." End quote. Froissart tells us that the figure of the Virgin in this chapel was renowned for its many virtues, and that the kings of England had much faith in the miracles performed at this shrine. When Richard left Westminster, he, quote, "made proclamation that all the commons of the country that were in London should meet him at Smithfield." End quote. In the Stowe manuscript, there is a very full and clear record of the subsequent proceedings. The king went to the house of the canons of St. Bartholomew, quote, "and then the mayor of London, William Walworth, came to the king, who commanded him to go to the commons to make their chieftain come to him, and when he was called by the mayor, Wat Tyler of Maidstone by name, he came to the king with great countenance, mounted on a small horse, so as to be seen by the commons, and dismounted, carrying a dagger in his hand, which he had taken from another man. And when he was dismounted, he took the king by the hand, half kneeling, and shook his arm sharply and strongly, saying to him, Brother, be of good comfort. And the king said to the said Wat, Why will you not go to your country? And the other replied with a great oath, that he and his companions would not go unless they had their charter such as they wished to have." End quote. The points are then set forth in fuller particularity than they were in the previous meeting at Mile End. Such demands as were not mentioned previously are as follows. Quote, "that there should be no law outside the law of Winchester. That no outlawry should be by any process of law made henceforth. That the goods of Holy Church should not be in the hands of men of religion, nor of the parsons and vicars, nor of others of Holy Church, but the Avantes should have their sustenance easily, and the remainder of the goods should be divided among the parishioners, and no bishop should be in England except one, and all the lands and tenements of the possessors should be taken from them and parted among the commons, saving to them their reasonable sustenance." To this the king replied easily, and said that he, Wat, should have all this that he, the king, could properly grant, saving to him the rights of his crown, commanding him, Wat, to go to his hold without more delay. End quote. From this point there are differences in the accounts, and it is difficult to be quite certain about the sequence of events which brought about Wat Tyler's death. Stowe accuses the leader of a deep-laid scheme for which there does not appear to be any special authority. He writes, quote, "Wat Tyler, being a crafty fellow, of excellent wit, but lacking grace, answered that peace be offered, but with conditions to his liking, minding to feed the king with fair words till the next day, that he might in the night have compassed his perverse purpose, for they thought the same night to have spoiled the city, the king first being slain, and the great lords that cleaved to him, to have burnt the city by setting fire in 4 parts thereof." End quote. We now have to coordinate the different accounts of the end of Wat Tyler. Some of these take no notice of the causes that led to Walworth's action, but Stowe's description seems in the main to make the whole scene clear, although he does not produce a consecutive narrative, but rather relates incidents out of their proper order. The great open space of Smithfield, the favourite meeting place on the north of London, and the chosen site for the tournaments and jousts, was crowded on all sides. Near the gate of St. Bartholomew's Priory were the king and his court, and farther to the west were the ranks of the commons set in order of battle. There had been some conference between the leaders, but no agreement had been come to, and naturally the state of tension was profound. Wat Tyler threatened the king, and took umbrage at the position of Sir John Newton, or Newington, keeper of Rochester Castle, who bore the king's sword. He treated with much disrespect the knight, who remarked that he recognized in the rebel leader the greatest thief and robber of his country. This so enraged Wat Tyler that he first ordered his followers to behead Newington, and then attempted to strike him with his dagger. At this, Walworth came forward and requested the king to allow him to arrest Wat, who struck at him, but without effect, as Walworth's armor protected him. The mayor then, in self-defense, attacked Wat and wounded him in the neck, and gave him a blow on the head. John Cavendish, or, as some say, Ralph Standish, then came forward in support of the mayor and wounded Wat in several places. The chieftain spurred his horse and cried to the commons to avenge him. After riding some 30 yards, he fell off his horse, half dead, and was taken to the hospital of St. Bartholomew's, where he died. What purports to be the dagger with which Walworth struck Wat Tyler is in the possession of the Fishmongers' Company. The suspense at this crisis must have been intense. The rebels prepared their bows, but the arrows were not let fly, for the king, spurring his horse, rode forward across the square to the host, and cried out, "Will you shoot your king? I am your captain and leader. Follow me." This brilliant display of courage by the beautiful boy of 14, who had the misfortune to be king, had its effect, and the commons followed him peaceably into the fields of Clerkenwell. Walworth raised a body of loyal citizens, and these marched out under the command of Sir Robert Knowles, and surrounded the rebels, who surrendered and asked for pardon. The host was divided into companies and sent to their respective homes under proper escort. Now that the authorities were triumphant, the leaderless rebels fared badly. On July 2nd, the charters were revoked. John Ball fled to the Midlands, and, according to Froissart, he was taken prisoner at Coventry in an old ruin. On the 15th of July, he was drawn, hanged, and quartered, just 1 month after the death of Wat Tyler. On December 13th, the king proclaimed a general pardon. A contemporary account of the insurrection was drawn up and inserted in the City Letter Book H. A translation of this is printed in Riley's Memorials. It is of great interest, but naturally no attempt at a judicial statement is made. The events are described as, quote, "among the most wondrous and hitherto unheard of prodigies that ever happened in the city of London," end quote. And it is stated that, quote, "hardly was there a street in the city in which there were not bodies lying of those who had been slain," end quote. The traitors who let in the mob are described as, quote, "perfidious commoners within the city," end quote. The whole account is written with spirit, and the ending of the fearful days is graphically described. Quote, "Therefore our Lord the King returned into the city of London with the greatest glory and honour, and the whole of this profane multitude in confusion fled forthwith for concealment in their affright. Our Lord the King, beneath his standard in the said field, with his own hands, decorated with the order of knighthood the said mayor, William Walworth, and Sir Nicholas Brember and Sir John Philipot, who had already been mayors of the said city, and also Sir Robert Lamb." End quote. Thus ended the Peasants' Rising, which, although it ended in total defeat to its promoters, exercised an enormous influence on the course of English history. The insurrection of Jack Cade was not so important an event as that of Wat Tyler, but it must not by any means be considered merely as an outbreak of the lower classes. Fabian, the alderman and sheriff, has left us particulars of the insurrection, and some further details have been discovered by Dr. James Gairdner, C.B., who has given a connected account in the preface to his authoritative edition of the Paston Letters, and also in the Dictionary of National Biography. It is almost impossible to understand the characters of the men who held responsible positions in the reign of Henry VI. The uncles of the king quarrelled among themselves, and their respective followers were hunted down by their enemies. William de la Pole, the 4th Earl and 1st Duke of Suffolk, a distinguished leader in the French wars, but a politician in later life, was the chief opponent of Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, the leader of the warlike party. Suffolk was an active agent for peace. Apparently, the English people were then very much like what they have been in later time. Peace after a successful war has usually been unpopular, and the unfortunate Suffolk was howled at for having given back the provinces to France. Quote, "By thee Anjou and Maine were sold to France. The false revolting Normans, thorough thee, disdain to call us lord, and Picardy hath slain their governors, surprised our forts, and sent the ragged soldiers wounded home." End quote. The Londoners were strongly antagonistic to Suffolk, who was generally accused of maladministration and malversation without definite charges. His friend could not protect him against his enemies, and when trying to escape to France, he was intercepted in the Straits of Dover, put in a little boat, and murdered. His body was thrown on the beach near Dover. It was afterwards buried by order of the king. His death did not satisfy the discontented, and other courtiers succeeded to his place in the disfavour of the people. Whole districts of the counties of Kent, Surrey, and Sussex rose in arms to the extent of 30,000 men, clamouring for the redress of grievances. The masses received assistance from some of the best families of these counties. The chronicler Gregory says that the captain, quote, "compassed all the gentles to arise with him." End quote. A man who called himself John Mortimer and affirmed that he was a cousin of the Duke of York was chosen to be leader. His real name was believed to be Cade. He was an Irishman who had had some experience in war and showed himself a strong leader. On the 1st of June 1450, a considerable army marched on London and encamped at Blackheath, where they formed a regular encampment. On hearing of this, Henry VI came from Leicester to London, where he arrived on the 6th. He took up his quarters at the Hospital of St. John's, Clerkenwell, and with him were 20,000 troops. The king sent to know the cause of the rising, and was answered thus, quote, "To destroy traitors being about him, with other diverse points." End quote. A message was then sent by the king, and proclamation was made that loyal men should immediately quit the field. Upon the night after, all the insurgents were gone, and the insurrection seemed to have come to an end. On the 11th of June, the king proceeded to Blackheath, and he found that the rebels had withdrawn in the night time. Instead of leaving well alone, it was decided to pursue the insurgents, and a detachment of the Royal Army under Sir Humphrey Stafford and his brother William was sent in pursuit. A battle took place on the 18th at Sevenoaks, in which both the Staffords were killed and the rest of the party completely routed. The followers of the king in the royal camp were dismayed, and many of them threatened that if justice was not done on certain traitors who had resisted the king, they would go over to the captain of Kent. One of the chief of these unpopular courtiers was James Fiennes, Lord Say and Sell, a follower of Suffolk, and to please the disaffected, he was sent to the Tower. The king withdrew to Greenwich, and the whole of the army dispersed. He returned to London by water and made preparations for removal to Kenilworth. The mayor and the commons beseeched him to remain in London, offering to live and die with him and to pay half the cost of his household, but he would not consent. The city authorities did not know what to do, and a party among them opened negotiations with the insurgents. Alderman Cooke passed to and fro under the safe conduct of the captain. Stowe prints in his chronicle, quote, "The safeguard and sign manual of the captain of Kent sent to Thomas Cooke, Draper of London, by the captain of the Great Assembly in Kent." End quote. He also gives, quote, "The complaint of the Commons of Kent," end quote, and, quote, "The requests by the captain of the Great Assembly in Kent," end quote. These are differently worded from the, quote, "proclamation made by Jack Cade," end quote, which has been printed from a manuscript in the handwriting of Stowe, but the sentiments and complaints in all of the documents are essentially the same. They contain a remarkable expression of the feelings of general unrest among the people, although they are doubtless very unjust to the character of the Duke of Suffolk and his followers. On the 1st of July, the insurgents entered Southwark and Jack Cade made the White Hart Inn his headquarters. According to Fabian, while the Commons of Kent settled themselves in Southwark, the rebels of Essex made, quote, "a field upon the plain of Mile End," end quote, their resting place. On the 2nd of July, a court was held by the mayor for the purpose of considering the best means of resisting the entry of the rebels into the city. It was found, however, that the majority were in their favour, so that Alderman John Horne was committed to Newgate for opposing the views of the malcontents. In the afternoon, about 5 o'clock, the insurgents were admitted into the city and passed over London Bridge, Cade cutting the ropes of the drawbridge with his sword. Cade then issued proclamations in the king's name against robbery and forced requisitions, and rode through the streets, taking the city under his complete control. When he came to the London Stone in Cannon Street, he struck it with his sword and said, quote, "Now is Mortimer lord of this city," end quote. This was a circumstance of the greatest interest in the history of London, for it shows that some special virtue was supposed, in the popular mind, to be connected with London Stone. Cade now gave orders to the mayor and returned to Southwark for the night. On Friday the 3rd of July, he returned to the city and sent for Lord Say and ordered him, after a mock trial, to be beheaded at the Standard in Cheapside. Cromer, an unpopular sheriff of Kent and son-in-law to Say, was beheaded at Mile End. As Jack Cade did not wish to be publicly recognised by those who knew his origin, he caused one Bailey, who was supposed to be an old acquaintance, to be beheaded at Whitechapel. Attention to the rules of order and honesty at length tired the leader, and Stowe relates that, quote, "he went into the house of Philip Malpas, draper and alderman, and robbed and spoiled his house, taking from thence great substance, and returned unto Southwark. On the next morrow he again entered the city, and dined that day in the parish of St. Margaret Pattens, at one Gerstie's house, and when he had dined, like an uncourteous guest, he robbed him, as the day before he had Malpas. For which two robberies, although the poor people drew to him and were partners in the spoil, yet the honest and wealthy commoners cast in their minds the sequel of this matter, and fear lest they should be dealt with in like manner." End quote. On Sunday the 5th of July, Cade and his followers remained in Southwark all day, and in the evening the mayor and citizens, with a force under the command of Matthew Goff, occupied London Bridge to prevent the Kentish men from entering the city. Desperate fighting on the bridge continued all through the night, from 9 o'clock till 9 on the following morning. Quote, "Sometime the citizens had the better, and sometimes the other, but ever they kept them upon the bridge, so that the citizens never passed much the bulwark at the bridge foot, nor the Kentish men no farther than the drawbridge. Thus continued the cruel fight to the destruction of much people on both sides." End quote. Matthew Goff, John Sutton, alderman, and Roger Hoysand, citizen, were among the killed. When the rebels got the worst of the encounter, a truce was made. A conference was arranged, and Waynfleet, Bishop of Winchester, and some others met Cade in St. Margaret's Church, Southwark. The bishop produced 2 general pardons sent by the Chancellor, Cardinal Kemp, Archbishop of York, one for the captain himself, and the other for his followers. These were eagerly accepted, as the insurgents were disgusted with their leader, and they were only too glad to return to their homes. It seems to have been generally believed that Cade was entitled to the name of Mortimer, but after this conference the truth got abroad, and his pardon was necessarily invalidated in consequence of this discovery. On the 12th of July, therefore, a proclamation of the king was issued for the apprehension of Cade, and the offer of a reward of 1,000 marks to anyone who should take him alive or dead. Cade escaped in disguise towards the woody country round Lewes. He was pursued by Alexander Iden, and captured and mortally wounded by him at Heathfield, Sussex, on the 13th. The place is known as Cade Street, and a stone with an inscription stands on the site of the capture. Cade's body was taken to London. His head was placed on London Bridge, and his 4 quarters were sent to different parts of Kent. Thus ended this dangerous rebellion. The whole history of the origin of the rising is most complicated. Not only, as already mentioned, were the gentry of Kent on the side of the rebels, but most of the important persons in Southwark supported them. There were Richard Dartmouth, Abbot of Battle, John Daniel, Prior of Lewes, and Robert Poynings, uncle of the Countess of Northumberland and husband of Margaret Paston. Quote, "When the pardon time came, a goodly list of names was recorded, with which it was thought wise to deal leniently." End quote. The second part of King Henry VI, which Shakespeare slightly altered from the first part of the contention betwixt the 2 famous houses of York and Lancaster, is chiefly concerned with Cade's rebellion. But it is sad that such a perversion of history should in any way be connected with the honoured name of our greatest poet. The libel against Suffolk, quote, "There let his head and lifeless body lie, until the Queen his mistress bury it," end quote, is apparently devoid of the slightest foundation. The representation of Cade is also a ridiculous travesty. His proclamation, which has come down to us, will be seen to be a very clear and ingenious piece of composition. Moreover, Latin is quoted in it, and therefore the writer is not likely to have considered it a crime to speak Latin. Cade's description of Lord Say, quote, "Thou hast most traitorously corrupted the youth of the realm in erecting a grammar school, and whereas before our forefathers had no other books but the score and the tally, thou hast caused printing to be used, and contrary to the king, his crown, and dignity, thou hast built a paper mill," end quote, has no foundation whatever in history. In spite of the anachronism of the allusion to the printing press, Gibbon was deceived by the description, and, in claiming Lord Say as an ancestor, styled him a martyr to learning. Dr. Gairdner discovered in Gregory's Chronicle a very remarkable statement which, if true, would throw great light upon the origin of the outbreak. Quote, "And after that, the Battle of Sevenoaks, upon the first day of Juil, the same captain come again, as the Kentish men said, but hit was another that named himself the captain, and he come to the Black Heath." End quote. Dr. Gairdner is inclined to take this as something more than a mere rumour, but he waits for some corroboration from another source before entirely accepting it. He adds in a note, quote, "The story of Jack Cade, however, is attended with difficulties from any point of view, and it is remarkable that when Cade's body was brought to London, it was taken to the White Hart at Southwark, where he had lodged before his entry into the city, and identified by the woman who kept the house. We hear nothing of its being identified by any one who had seen the leader before the Battle of Sevenoaks." End quote. End of Chapter 2, Part 3. End of Section 5.